From These Eyes to Power in the Music, the legacy of the Canadian supergroup, the Guess Who. Our special guest is Canadian journalist and writer Mark Doble. This is the Outdated Entertainment Hour. And they said it wouldn't last, right? Hi, everybody. This is Bob Smith. This is the Outdated Entertainment Hour. You may know me from my 17 years in Long Island writing about music, as well as in upstate New York, and in other magazines around the country. You might know me from my other podcast, The Outdated Wrestling Hour, but this podcast is all about entertainment from years gone by. And in the news lately has been the legacy of the Canadian supergroup, the Guess Who, which is the first Canadian group ever to score major hits during the rock era in the United States and around the world. I mean, so many great players, from Burton Cummings all the way to Domenic Troiano. This was a group unlike any other, totally original. Many people consider them one of their favorite bands. Why they're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is beyond me. But in this edition, we're going to take a loving look back at their RCA period, which is, to me, the period that counts. From the Wheatfield Soul album in 1969 all the way to Power in the Music in 1975. Our guest is Mark Doble, who wrote a great book about the last Guess Who lead guitarist, Domenic Troiano. We're going to talk all about that. We're going to spend a little bit extra time on Domenic because of Mark's relationship with him and the work he did on a really great book that you all really need to avail yourselves of. If you've never heard of Domenic Troiano, seek him out. Go on YouTube, type his name in a Google search bar. To me, he ranks with Clapton and all the other great guitar players, Allman, all of them, in the history of rock and roll. He played like no one else, completely original. His talent was undeniable once you got to hear him and understand what he was doing. He could play everything from so-called progressive rock to country to jazz to blues to rock to disco. He scored a major hit with a quasi-disco song called We All Need Love. An all-around encompassing musician. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about Burton Cummings and Randy Bachman, all the great members of the Guess Who. So for right now, enough of my yakking. We're going to take a short commercial break here before we bring on Mark Doble and our story about the Guess Who. But here's a voice of somebody who worked with Burton Cummings on one of the Ringo Starr All-Stars tours. It's Joe Walsh.
This is Joe Walsh. One thing I do when I'm not playing rock and roll is get on the air as an amateur radio operator. Also called ham radio, is a communication service provided by ordinary people just like you and me. We have a national emergency communication system in place 24/7, 365. Find out more about amateur radio at arrl.org/What is ham radio? See you on the air.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm like a kid in a candy store right now because I'm talking to someone from wonderful Canada who is a music expert and somebody I've admired for a long time. Back in 2021, a new book came out about my favorite musician in the world, Domenic Troiano, the guitar player extraordinaire. The book is entitled Domenic Troiano, His Life and Music. It is still available. If you don't know Domenic and you'd like to know more, get this book. It is lovingly and lavishly detailed. It's every little nuance of his life and his music career and quotes from the people who knew him best. It's a fantastic piece of work. It's written with Dominic's brother, Frank Troiano. I don't want to leave that out. But in any event, I have the co-author of this book. He's a veteran journalist from Canada. His name is Mark Doble. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob. It's nice to be here.
I'm as excited as I could be. The Guess Who was the first 45 I ever bought with my own money.
Wow.
Way back in the day, at James Way. It was a department store chain in upstate New York, where I'm from. And where I was from, the Guess Who got a lot of airplay.
Very cool.
Tons of airplay. Even I remember buying the single for Rain Dance and a couple of and a couple of the tunes that weren't hits, but they got a lot of play. So I became a fan, and they just worked for me. I can't even explain why in the early days. And then when I bought the cassette of the Best of the Guess Who,
Yes.
and I wore that out, and I have every note they ever played. And I think that the musicians are spectacular. And Burton Cummings, I was a performing artist in my own right. I can't sound like Burton Cummings, but he was a big influence on me. I'm telling you right now.
Not too many people can sound like Burton Cummings. Don't feel too bad.
No. So, tell me about your history with the band. Tell me what you know, who you've met, where you've been.
Well, I basically I'm a fan. I did a music degree at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, which is just south of Toronto. Back in the 1970s, I did a little bit of work while I was at university. I was at the university radio station, and that gave me access to all kinds of things, able to go to concerts and stuff. But I was a huge fan of the Guess Who from the time I was probably 13 or 14 years old. I was a piano player, and back in those days, there weren't too many rock and roll players that were playing the piano. I mean, this is before Elton John was really making it over here in North America. So here we had this guy from Canada named Burton Cummings who was playing the piano on things like Albert Flasher and Bus Rider, and all of a sudden, hey, this is cool. So I became I guess I'm an obsessive completist fan. I had to hear everything they did and collect everything they did. I went to concerts, and after a while, I worked up my nerve to meet some of these players, and over the years, I've had the occasion to meet with pretty much every member of that classic Guess Who period of time, with the exception of Jim Cale. Never had the chance to do that, and of course, Kurt Winter, who passed away in 1997. I never had the opportunity to meet Kurt, which is a real regret. I would have loved to have met Kurt Winter. He would have been a very interesting person to speak to. But no, I've done that. What was kind of cool was in the late 90s, when I guess it was shortly after we got on the internet, Domenic Troiano, I was in touch with somebody that had recorded with Domenic, and I said to the fellow that I was speaking with, I said, I'd love to be able to communicate and connect with Domenic. Do you have a mailing address? And lo and behold, he had a mailing address. So I wrote Domenic Troiano this letter out of the blue, telling him that I was a fan, hoping that he was doing well. I'd heard of his health setbacks at that point in time. And, back in the 90s, it was, when are these albums from back in the day going to be released on CD? Is there any hope? And all this type of thing. Had a whole bunch of questions. And I mailed it and forgot about it. About 4 weeks later, I get a letter out of the blue from Domenic Troiano. And a very nice letter apologizing for the delay in replying, outlining, answering every single one of my questions. Very gracious. And the neat thing about that letter was it was done on his company letterhead. So there was a phone number. And so then I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to do? I don't want to stalk this guy, but so on a Sunday afternoon, I picked up the phone and gave him a call. He answered the phone. I told him who I was, and right away he said, "Oh, Mark, yes, you wrote that letter. I'd love to chat with you." However, this is what he said. He said, "My father passed away. I have to go to the wake this afternoon. Let's talk tonight." At which point I said, "Look, your dad passed away. You don't need me bothering you." He says, "Mark, I want to talk to you. I want you to call me tonight. Call me around 9:30. And I said, "I will call you, but I want you to promise that if it's not a good time, that we don't, just tell me and we'll do this another time." He said, "No, you give me a call." Now, Frank figures that For Domenic, that was therapy. Anyway, I called him up at 9:30 that night, and we talked for about 3 hours on the phone, and he talked about everything. He was such a nice, open, engaging individual, gracious, considerate. As he did, he got a sense of who I was, and I would, out of the blue, I'd get a phone call from him saying, "Mark, I just got word from Sony Music that that Power in the Music is going to be released on CD. I just thought you'd like to hear about that." And that would be the message on the phone. So, we would talk on the phone. In my work, I was in Toronto frequently. So if I was in Toronto overnight, I'd call him, and on a number of occasions, he would come down to the hotel, and we'd sit in the restaurant drinking coffee. He would have green tea and dessert, and we would talk to midnight just about, he was just one of those people that wanted to know about you, wanted to answer all of your questions, and he was just a really wonderful, considerate personality. I've said to some people that, you want to be careful about meeting your heroes, because as individuals, they might disappoint you. You could be disappointed. You need to be able to separate the artist from the art, because they might not be a nice person, and that could color your appreciation and your enjoyment in the future. Not with Domenic Troiano.
Mm-hmm.
Domenic Troiano was an exceptional human being. So Frank Troiano, I got to know Frank shortly before Domenic passed away. I was actually at their home when Domenic was in his last hours in Richmond Hill, Ontario, and with Frank, and about probably about 6 hours before he passed away. It was a very profound and emotional time, but they were very accommodating. So Frank and I stayed in touch. When I retired from my business in 2016, I talked to him about the idea of writing a book. But then I got called into, I contracted to do some work, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So the idea of a book got put on the shelf. So consequently, in 2020, just at the start of COVID, in March of 2020, Frank Troiano phones me up and he says to me, "Mark, if we're ever going to write this book, we've got to do it now. Domenic's been gone for 15 years, and the people we need to talk to, they're not going to be available for much longer." And he was absolutely right, of course. And so we started into it. Frank would reach out to, I think we got submissions and interviews from 186 different people.
Mm-hmm.
Friends, family members. You see it in the book, of course. And that most of that was Frank. I basically wrote the book, but I could not have written it without all of the information that Frank got. And so, as I said to him, "Frank, you have to have a co-authorship on this, because I couldn't write this book without everything you've done." Frank, of course, had the connections with everybody. So, we've been able to reach out to people like David Foster, Robbie Robertson, David Clayton Thomas, Gary Katz with Steely Dan, and it was I couldn't have done it. He was able to do that for me. And so during COVID, while everybody's self-isolating, I'm sitting at my computer typing away with Domenic Troiano playing in the background, typing away about my record collection. I was in my glory. It was just fun.
Mm-hmm. Now, for those in the lower 48 where I live, right, who may
Yes.
not know the legacy of Domenic Troiano, tell the people who wrote the foreword in this book.
The people that wrote in this book, well,
the foreword,
the forward, yeah, of course. Yes. Yes. A fellow that you might have heard of named Alex Lifeson, for the guitarist with Rush. He was a huge fan of Domenic. First met him when he was 13 years old, and Alex stayed in touch with him. In later years, when Domenic was basically retired as a performing artist, he would go into a little club in Toronto, North Toronto, called the Orbit Room. And the Orbit Room was a little rhythm and blues club owned by a fellow by the name of Tim Notter and Alex Lifeson. So Alex would have all of these top Toronto musicians playing in the Orbit Room, and Domenic would walk in, and if Alex was on the stage, he would just stop everything, tell the audience that Domenic had shown up, and it was like, everybody would basically burst into a round of applause, and he was just there to sit. Anyway, he would end up sitting in and playing with Alex. After Domenic passed away, they established a musical scholarship in his honor, and Alex was one of the people that was on the selection committee for that. So we reached out to Alex, and Alex wrote an amazing foreword. I'll tell you something about the submissions in the book that we have from everybody. Every time we received a submission, we made sure that we had the right to edit, and we had to do that because this document would have been so maudlin if we included everything that people said. Like, right. My experience with Domenic is a very gracious person. My experience was not unique. This is how he treated most people. People loved Domenic Troiano. So, so we edited virtually every, but not Alex Lifeson's. Not one word. His forward came in one Monday evening, and Frank sent it to me. He said, "The Eagle has landed." I looked it through, and I got back to Frank, and I said, "We don't have to change a thing. This is perfect."
Unbelievable. Just so great. And I will say this. This is why people need to get this book, particularly guitar players or people into guitar playing. You will find out the secrets of why Domenic was so special as a player, particularly on rhythm guitar. I'm not going to reveal what's said in the book, but he did something I've never heard of before or since. We heard of all the hammer-on guys, with the pinky and all that stuff. Wait till you find out how Domenic was able to play leads and rhythm at the same time.
You will notice.
Very few people can do that.
You will notice that over Domenic's career, whether he was playing with Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, the Five Rogues, the Mandela, Bush, his solo career, the James Gang, the Guess Who, not once was there another guitarist in the band.
Right. They didn't need one.
No.
This is an aside. This is a James Gang song with Domenic. By the way, he was with the James Gang too. He's the guy that replaced Joe Walsh in the James Gang.
Yeah.
And there's a song called Up to Yourself, which is the most unbelievable rhythm pattern. You hear a solo guitar and it's carrying the band. It's funk and rock at the same time, and it's a spectacular performance. Do you agree with me on that one?
I do. And, it's really quite amazing. Frank has told me that when Domenic was about 15 years old, he went to his dad, and Domenic was very gifted. He was very good in school. He was very artistic. He was very popular. He was highly regarded, very mature young man. And he went to his dad, and he said to his dad, "I want to try something. I want either you buy me an old beat up car that I can work on and fix it up, or you buy me a guitar." So his dad, thank God, his dad bought him this cheap guitar at the local Eaton store, and Domenic brought home that guitar and just started working on it. He was 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
By the time he was 17 years old, he was the undisputed number one guitarist on the rock and roll strip on Yonge Street in Toronto, up or down Yonge Street. There were some great guitarists, but there was only one Domenic Troiano.
And that book does detail that too. That's why people need to read it. Oh man, I'm glad you described him the way he is, because he's fulfilling everything I ever thought about him. That I had heard about him. I got to see the Domenic Troiano band when he was on Capitol Records. They had just released, I think, the first album, which was The Joke's on Me. No, not The Joke's on Me, excuse me. Burning at the Stake, the first one.
Burning at the Stake was his first Capitol Records album.
And somehow they ended up playing this club in Albany where I was from. And I got to go. And that's when I went, That's when I went. I just sat and I was alone. I couldn't find anybody that knew who Domenic Troiano was, right? So I went by myself. I didn't care. So I'm sitting in this club, I'm nursing a drink, and I'm watching the tightest, groovinest. It wasn't jazz, but it was. It wasn't funk, but it was. It wasn't rock and roll, but it was. There's nothing he couldn't play. There's no style he didn't master. And I'm telling you, that's when it cemented it all for me. Seeing that tight band, I think Paul DeLong was on drums and the great keyboard players that he had. Great bass player. I mean, and I'll tell you, here's another achievement that Domenic did. He introduced the world to Prakash John.
Yes.
And Prakash John's son is the new lead singer in Tower of Power. And I'm so proud.
Both Jordan John and Prakash are two absolutely monster talents.
Oh my gosh, yes. Oh my God.
You listen to the Bush album. If I don't know if you've ever been able to listen to that.
Oh, I own it.
And I mean, Prakash can match Domenic note for note. Nobody can do that.
No.
But Prakash could. And they went down before they recorded the Bush album. They went down and they lived at this house in Arizona. They had a friend that basically said, you guys can plant yourselves in this house and just practice till your heart's content. They were apparently next door to Barry Goldwater's estate. But but this is back in 1970. And so they practiced all summer long. And Prakash would tell me that the other two guys, Whitey Glenn, the drummer, and Roy Kenner, they'd go off on their own. But after 6 hours of practice, but Prakash and Domenic, they just didn't stop. They just played and played and played. Not that, I mean, Whitey was an absolutely phenomenal drummer. I mean,
they both went on to back up some of the biggest names in music, both pop and rock, right?
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And I will say this, like, I got to throw this in. The song "The Answer" on the first Domenic Troiano album on Mercury Records, called Domenic Troiano.
Yep.
When they go from the vocal into the first guitar solo, both him and Prakash just start going. It's exciting. The hair on my arms is standing up just thinking about how good the playing is and how unique it was. Nobody sounded like this.
Nobody.
So we will get back to Domenic in a while, but boy, thanks for writing this book. And I want everybody to check it out. And I want people to, and here's another thing you got to do: rediscover or discover for the first time Domenic Troiano's music, because thanks to the beauty of the digital world, which isn't always beautiful, most of his stuff is out again. You can find those albums. There's one's called Fret Fever. This is the first album of Domenic Troiano. Tricky is a personal favorite. Side 2 of Tricky is one of the greatest 20 minutes you'll ever hear. Right? I mean, it's got everything on it.
You got to think about that. At the recording of that album was when Domenic was in the process of extricating himself from the James King.
Mm-hmm.
He was leaving the group. And he had already recorded, this was his second solo album. And he had access to the best musicians in Los Angeles at the time when he was recording that album. And I think side 2 of Tricky is probably the most Steely Dan-ish version of Domenic that you will hear. But this was the music that he was doing when the phone call came from the Guess Who saying, would you like to join our band? And that was a tough one for Domenic, because he was going off in his own musical direction. He was talking to people like David Foster, Willie Weeks. These guys were the cream of the crop. And then all of a sudden, the Guess Who wants to join their band. And I mean, he had played on Randy Bachman's solo album in 1970. He certainly knew who the Guess Who were. And in fact, he had, before that phone call came, he'd come in and played on this soundtrack for a movie that Burton was in the process of making called A Fool, I Met a Fool, that was aborted. And that's where they experienced Domenic, because he came in just ready. he would listen to the song once, and then he would start playing solos. He'd play 6 solos for you and leave the studio, and you could pick whichever one you wanted because they were all perfect and they were all different.
He could do anything.
Yep.
There's a videotape floating on YouTube of Domenic and Burton. I don't know where this was, but I think he's with Burton singing with Don Everly. You probably know what this is.
Yes, this
Dominic's
is
part of that band, and at one point something goes on, and Domenic, I think, is forced into taking a solo, and it was perfect. He could play anything. I mean, it's just, oh, guys, you got to hear Domenic Troiano. I really mean this. I am a one-man, finally, because I'm starting an entertainment podcast, because I have another podcast. But I am telling you, this is my sounding board I haven't had a chance to have. Domenic Troiano is the greatest guitar player too many of you have never heard, and it's time. I guarantee you'll find something to like. I don't know what else to say, but
well,
I got the megaphone out now. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, it's interesting. He was invited by Gary Katz to join Steely Dan on 2 different occasions. The first time he turned them down because he had just accepted an invitation to join the James Gang. And Domenic the guy has integrity, and he had principles, and he felt once he'd given a commitment, he had to stay with that commitment. And wouldn't you know it, just after he said yes to Burton and the Guess Who, Steely Dan called again, and he turned them down. And he would have been so perfect in Steely Dan.
Yeah, musically he was, but you made a good point in an interview you did on Rock Music History, that wonderful YouTube show.
Yep.
You made a great point there, in that they were, Becker and Fagan were real, like, our way kind of guys. We want to do it this way. This is what we need. There's a classic story. There's a classic story of Rick Derringer coming into the studio, and he played for hours and hours, and they didn't take any of it. It wasn't right, and they sent him home. And but I don't think that would have happened with Domenic. But Domenic also, I think, has his own way of doing things. I think you pointed that out.
Very strong personality. I've had this conversation in the past, and particularly with Frank. Domenic was very much, it was going to be on his terms. Everything that Domenic did was on his terms. When he joined the Guess Who, he set some certain rules. Number 1, he was going to have a co-writing credit for every song that was recorded. He was going to get a 25% share of the band right up front. The band was going to rehearse. He would be the musical director, so he did all the arrangements, and so, the rest of the guys knew what they were getting when they got this guy, but he's a guy that he was always thinking about 5 things and things. He was way ahead of everybody, and always thinking about 5 things while you were thinking about one thing, and it was hard to keep up. Here's a quote. I want to read you a quote and this was from Roy Kenner, and Roy sang with Domenic in several groups, but I included this quote in the chapter on the Guess Who. And this is Roy saying, "If Dominic's greatest strength was his obsession and dedication to his musical craft, it was also his greatest weakness. He would go right over top of you because he already had 5 different ideas or approaches while you were still working on one. You had to be on your game to keep up. Donnie could make you feel intimidated, but it was never on purpose. Once you stick him into an environment where he is part of the unit, things get dicey with those who are used to being in control. You praise the guy for making you better because they make you play with him. He makes you better, but after a while, you can start to resent his dominating nature." And that is the way he was. There was nothing malicious about it, but he knew what he wanted to do. Jack Richardson, and I'm really sorry that Jack had passed away before we started this book, because I had numerous conversations with Jack Richardson. He loved Domenic. When Domenic came into the studio, the whole band stepped up to the next level. They became much more professional as a group. Not that the other guys weren't good, but Domenic was he was on a different level.
No, Garry Peterson and Burton Cummings were really good players. I mean, they were really exceptional players. Even before Domenic joined, and they stepped their game up. They really did.
Well, here's the thing about Burton. Burton, Burton, I would argue the greatest vocalist in rock and roll history, certainly right up there with Robert Plant and Steven Tyler and Paul McCartney. But as a piano player, he's a good piano player. He doesn't have a strong left hand, but he's a good piano player. He's an adequate piano player. But Burton is also a pro. And as good as Domenic was on stage, there is no way Burton Cummings would ever let somebody like Domenic Troiano upstage him. Therefore, Burton had to up his game. His piano playing, his keyboard playing was never better than when he was playing in that iteration of the Guess Who in 1974, 75, because he had to practice. And that continued on because immediately after the Guess Who broke up, Burton went into the studio in a little place called Rhodes Studio in a house in Winnipeg and started recording with Ian Gardner and Gordy Osland. And they just started doing demos. And there's a number of demos that Burton has shared over the years over the internet. The piano playing is outstanding. It's better. It's as good as Burton ever sounded. And I would say that's a direct flow from the time that Domenic was in the band. He basically forced Burton to up his game, and he did. I mean, Burton certainly rose to the occasion. His playing was outstanding.
Yes, absolutely. But you know what? Everybody I know who knows Domenic said, "Oh my God, he would have been great in Steely Dan." They all say the same thing. He said, "Yeah, I'm thinking about this. It just sounds like a marriage made in heaven." But
I wonder
it
if
never occurred.
Yeah, Domenic and Fagen and Becker, they were all geniuses, and you can only have so many geniuses in the room, and so you just kind of wonder how long it would have lasted, because they were all very strong-willed individuals. So who knows? But Domenic did come down and record for Donald Fagen's first solo album, Nightfly, and he recorded several solos. Unfortunately, none of those solos they weren't chosen. I mean, they had Carlton playing in from Steely Dan there, and he got most of them. But I would love to have heard those solos on those Nightfly tracks. It'd be wonderful to be able to hear that. But somehow I don't ever see Gary Katz ever letting that out of the bag.
If we could find the tracks, right?
I know.
All right, let us move from our love of Domenic, because we really do. And again, the book is called Domenic Troiano, His Life and Music. Type in the name Domenic Troiano on Amazon. Get your book, will you? You're going to love it. You're really going to enjoy this book. And we all enjoyed the Guess Who. Even major fans who weren't nuts for him like I was, they were so popular in the early 70s.
Yep.
And I will say this, coming out of Canada, they were the hosts of a not American Bandstand, a shindig type show called Let's Go. Right? You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, is that when Jack Richardson discovered them? Because I'll tell you what, I want to ask you a question before we get into the albums. I think Jack Richardson is the secret behind the Guess Who's success. Maybe not that much of a secret, because he saw how good that band was. He said, "I got to get these guys on wax," and he did. He was the driving force. Am I reading it wrong, or is that basically what happened?
No. I agree with you 100%, Bob. When Jack came in, all of a sudden the group developed production values, and they just and you could just see that from a Wild Pair on. They started to be doing all kinds of different things that in the past they were pretty basic. They were basically a jukebox machine. They could play anything that anybody else did, but Jack forced them out of that comfort zone. And oh no, there's no question. His production, his leadership in developing that band was a critical piece of this.
Absolutely. I think Jim Cale said, Jim Cale once said he was the reason. It's like he had He said he had something like unparalleled integrity, which is a nice thing to say about anybody.
Yep.
I mean, the guy mortgaged his house to get those tracks made, I believe, right?
Yep. Yep.
Tremendous. So a big tip of the cap to producer Jack Richardson, who recorded every single note they played for RCA.
Yeah, that's right.
He never switched producers, and I think that says exactly what you need to know. Most groups do. Guess who never did?
Nope.
And Jack went on to record people like Bob Seger and Poco too. So he had quite the career. He's a legend. He's a legend. His son is a producer now, right?
Yes. And Garth Richardson, and I've had some communications with Garth over the years. Very well thought of. The other thing about Jack, in his later years, he taught studio technology and production at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours southwest of Toronto, and so I've met up with people that were in that course, and of course Jack in that class was telling them stories about recording the Guess Who, recording Alice Cooper. There's a really interesting I mean, Jack was a jazz guy. He was a bass player, and we had a big band up here called the Boss Brass, Rob McConnell and the Boss Brass, and they recorded a direct-to-disc album at the Nimbus 9 studios on Hazelton Avenue in Toronto. And I had a friend of mine that was at that recording, and it was just, oh yeah. I mean, this guy, Jack was far more accomplished. He was more than just a rock and roll guy. Absolutely. No, he had a gift.
You know what I think one of the most remarkable achievements of all the Guess Who singles is Hand Me Down World, and here's why. If you listen to that record, it's clear as a bell.
Mm-hmm.
It has the least amount of effects I've ever heard on a top 40 rock song. You don't hear effects on the guitars. You don't hear effects on the vocal. It just sounds so plainer, but it's so perfect. The Guess Who as a band in that period, I think it was Kurt Winter and Greg Lescue. I hope I pronounced Greg Lescue's name correctly.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
They didn't use a whole lot of effects. At least I didn't hear them.
No.
And they didn't use them on that song, and it's so tight, and it sounds so good. You can hear the blend of every instrument. I think it's one of his best production jobs on a single. I really do.
It's good. Hand Me Down World, of course, was the follow-up single to American Woman,
right?
And Randy had just left the band, and the band they brought in new guys. They wanted to redefine themselves immediately. I mean, they had a bit of an album already in the can, almost ready to go, but it wasn't complete. But they scrapped that at that point in time, and they went into the studio. And the first thing they cut was "Hand Me Down World," which was a tune from a group that Kurt Winter had been in called Brother, and they had done that was a Brother tune. And they did "Hand Me Down World" and "Bus Rider" from that Brother catalog. But you see, the Guess Who didn't have a lot of extra music kicking around because Randy was the primary writer in the Guess Who before he left, Randy and Burton. So Burton's there on his own, and all of a sudden they've got to get new material out on the radio almost immediately after American Woman starts to come down the charts, and "Hand Me Down World" was almost the perfect follow-up. It had this righteous protest and indignation. This just a very clean, simple, straight ahead rock and roll with the signature Burton Cummings vocal performance that basically made every song special. It was the perfect follow-up to American Woman.
Absolutely. No question about it. It kept the hit train rolling. It really did. Bus Rider got a lot of play too. So it was like, all right, let's go back to the beginning. The very first album was called Wheatfield Soul. And where am I looking here? I have some notes here. And because this is outdated, I want you folks to know I'm using paper. Could you hear that? I use paper, folks. Keep your AI. I use paper. But anyway, the first record, Wheatfield Soul, was a hodgepodge.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I liked it, but to me, it was the sound of a band finding their feet. It was a lot of different styles all on that one record.
I think that's entirely fair.
Mhm.
Yeah, you go from you go from things like the pink wine sparkles in the glass to something as bizarre as Friends of Mine, which is
Yeah.
a Jim Morrison wannabe thing, and then you go to a Wednesday in Your Garden, which is a magnificent piece of songwriting craft that by Randy Bachman. But yeah, I think it was an album that was. I mean, this is the one that Jack Richardson mortgaged his house for.
Mhm.
They had written a number of songs for the Wild Pair, and Jack was encouraging them to keep writing material. And Burton and Randy prided themselves on their versatility, their ability to replicate almost anything, regardless of the style. So I think in many respects, when they put together Wheatfield Soul, it was less focused. It was more about this is a showcase of what the Guess Who can do.
Mhm.
So, yeah, when you listen to it, especially if it's not the first Guess Who album you ever listened to, you're kind of scratching your head saying, "Really?" But no, you think back at the time, this was one of the first Canadian albums to be released internationally, and of course, These Eyes. Jack Richardson knew that These Eyes was going to be a monster hit, and and actually, Burton and Randy, they wanted to be rockers. They didn't want These Eyes to be the hit single, but Jack, gosh darn it, had mortgaged his house. So how are you going to argue with him about it? So they said, "Are you kidding me? This is a single. It's got hit written all over it," and it made the group. I mean, it did. Consequently, you see albums like Canned Wheat start to become more focused. American Woman is even more focused than Canned Wheat, in a more straight ahead rock and roll vein.
Right. I think
Um,
that's the one they were waiting to record, that one.
oh
They had the opportunity, then they were hot,
yeah,
and they took that right turn, and it worked.
oh yeah, and to the point where they even dipped into their back catalog and re-recorded things like No Time.
Well, they had to, and I'll let's go back to the previous 2 albums, okay, and we'll
Yes,
get to that because you made a great point there. First of all, Wednesday in Your Garden, which is from the first album,
yes,
the Staples singers did a fantastic cover of that. I don't know if you've ever heard it.
yes,
It
absolutely.
it's fantastic.
Yeah,
It's like so you knew they were being taken seriously by their peers in the music world.
yeah,
We move on to the second record, and you can correct me if my statements are wrong. They were in Chicago or New York, I can't remember which, and the recording studio was the
New
old
York.
place where people like Perry Como would record, and they didn't have the right equipment, and everything sounded bad.
Yeah.
Everything sounded flat.
Hmm.
It didn't have a rock and roll feel. So at that point, Richardson says, "You got 2 great songs." So they did "Laughing and Undone" with Phil Spector? No, not Phil Spector.
No,
Um,
Bill Ramone.
Phil Ramone, a guy I almost worked with, by the way.
Right.
I was scouted by Phil Ramone. I can say that. As a singer, I was scouted by Phil Ramone. He
Very
didn't he
cool.
didn't take me under his wing, but he did scout me, okay?
Hey,
But anyway, so that's why those 2 songs sound so much better than the rest of that record because, even the last song, which is the longest song, it's called Key, and his drum solos, and the sound just doesn't it's not a rock and roll sound.
it's interesting. I like Wheatfield Soul. Or sorry, Canned Wheat. I really do,
Mhm.
and I love the songs, the other songs. But it is interesting that when Iconoclastic came out about 20 years ago and started reissuing each of the Guess Who albums, there were only 2 albums from that RCA group of albums that they never released. One was Live at the Paramount, and the other was Canned Wheat. And I kind of wonder if that's really the reason why was
Yeah.
because the production just wasn't there, the sound quality just wasn't there. But I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. But you know what? Laughing and Undone, man, made up for all of it.
Oh yeah,
And that's in the days of the two-sided hit, which you would of course, there's no records anymore, but
no.
it was rare even then that you'd have one record become a hit, and some DJ here in the States flipped it over and said, "Listen to this." And Undone is a work of art. Maybe Burton calls it maybe Randy's greatest song he ever wrote, and he may be right about that.
It's a good song. It's a terrific song. I'll take this. I'll point this one out to you. Good, Randy Bachman, and don't get me wrong, I respect him. He was a great musician, a terrific songwriter. But Randy was always taking care of business, so to speak, and looking out for number one. And you can go back to pre-Shaken All Over and listen to all of the singles that the Guess Who released right up until American Woman. And look at the flip sides. And you will see that the flip sides are quite often solely written by Randy Bachman. What These Eyes, the flip side was A Wednesday in Your Garden. American Woman, the flip side was No Sugar Tonight. Not No Sugar Tonight in New Mother Nature, just No Sugar Tonight. The flip side to Laughing, Undone. All Randy Bachman compositions. And I just can't see that as being coincidental.
No. By the way, just as an aside, I'm flipping through YouTube one day. I like to listen to music and, concert clips on YouTube.
Yep.
And here's the Flesh Tones. You probably know about this. And they do It's My Pride, which is one of the pre-RCA singles.
A great record.
Yeah.
A great record.
Yeah, probably one of Jim Cale's best performances on bass is on It's My Pride. That song just rocks. And the Flesh Tones just have a ball with it. It's great.
So put It's My Pride on your record player, and as soon as that song is finished, put on the BTO 2 album and go to I'm a Tramp. Same rep.
I get it. Yeah, that's
Same
right.
rep.
I never would have thought of that. Nice, Mark.
Hey, it's not stealing. It's not stealing because you wrote it in the first place. So you can't fault them for it. Yeah.
So we've had These Eyes. We've had Laughing and Undone. Here comes the American Woman album and single. Randy Bachman with, first of all, his guitar work on both the remade No Time and American Woman. That creamy yet tough tone. Unforgettable.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one of his shining moments. He's had many of them, but I'll tell you what, his guitar work on that entire album it's his first time I think he developed a signature style on that record. And boom, you finally found out how good a guitar player Randy Bachman was and how much he wanted to rock and roll, because that album is the toughest thing they made of the three that we talked about.
That's right. And I'll tell you, somebody that was a huge admirer of Randy Bachman was Domenic Troiano.
Mm-hmm.
That surprised me because the two are very different in their style. But Domenic said, oh no, this man is a very talented guy. And Domenic, of course, played on Axe that was recorded in Chicago in March of 1970, just about 6 weeks before Randy left the Guess Who. But Domenic got called in to record on that. And of course, we talk about that in the book. But no. Domenic held Randy in very high regard. And frankly, I asked Randy one time about why he got Domenic involved. And of course, Randy said, hey, listen, I had the highest regard for Domenic Troiano. He was an amazing musician. Interesting story that's in our book. In 1971, Bush was touring Canada, and they were coming into Winnipeg, and they played Taj Hall at the University of Manitoba. It's a music hall. And all the musicians in Winnipeg came to that concert. Randy Bachman was no longer in the Guess Who, and he was scheduled to be out of the country. But when he heard that Bush was coming to town, he canceled his plans so that he could be there. They waited in that hall. They couldn't start the concert for about half an hour until the 5 members of the Guess Who at that time walked into the room, because they had to. They waited for them to be there. They didn't want to miss it. They wanted to take in this phenomenal musician, Domenic Troiano, and they were there for that. But no, the admiration for Domenic and Randy was definitely a mutual thing. They held each other in very high regard.
Wow, very interesting. That's great. But we'll go back to the American Woman album. To me, it's their first cohesive album. The others were good.
I would agree.
This had a theme to it, an intro and an outro. The songs blended. There was rockers, and there was a song like Talisman. It all sounded like a fully realized band at that point, and with a fully realized style.
I agree 100% with you. And I would also say this: when you listen to The Way They Were, which was the tunes of the song that they were working on after American Woman,
Mm-hmm.
that didn't have the same cohesion.
No, it
And
didn't.
had those 7 songs. Well, first of all, there would have been more than just those 7 songs on a subsequent album to American Woman. There would have had to have been. Had that been the release after American Woman, we might never have heard of the Guess Who again.
I'll tell you what, it's 76 or 77 when the RCA released that as a contractual obligation record.
That's right.
They dug up those tracks and threw them out there.
Yep.
And I remember Silverbird from that getting some airplay on FM in my area. I was like, holy smokes. So I rushed to buy the record. And I will say this, a couple of the songs were kind of interesting on that record, but I could tell they weren't finished. Those songs were not finished.
That's exactly right.
The song The Answer, there's a song where Bachman is just playing a single note. Dum, 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 dum. That was just keeping space. That was Phil. That wasn't meant to be released like that. He would have played a solo over that passage. So I'm hearing it with the musicians here and I'm going, this record wasn't finished. And I'm kind of upset that they released it in that form because I don't think it was fair. But
well, you're absolutely right. It was the Guess Who owed RCA Records one more album when Burton pulled the pin, and RCA was ready to. They'd had enough of the Guess Who. They hadn't put out a Share the Land album in 5 years, and so they were ready to say goodbye to the Guess Who. But the contractual obligation for one more record is the reason why The Way They Were was released. And you're absolutely right. The Guess Who had a practice of double tracking in the studio, double tracking the guitars, double tracking their vocals for sure, and double tracking their bass. And that wasn't done on The Way They Were. So that's why it sounds very incomplete compared to what we'd heard on American Woman. So you're absolutely right, Bob.
Although I like the song The Answer overall, as a song, I think that would have worked if it was finished, and I've heard 2 different versions of that song on different compilations that they put out. One with a longer outro with a lot of guitar on it. Another one that just kind of ends. The one with all the guitar in it in the end was really an interesting passage, and I thought it was kind of cool.
Yep.
But you're right. Everybody in the band says that would have gone nowhere. It didn't even sound like the American Woman Guess Who. That's the odd part about it.
Yes.
But that American Woman album, great songs like Proper Stranger, which I thought should have been a single. Maybe it was, I don't know. But I thought that would have been a hit record too. Classic album.
Yes.
It stands the test of time. You put that on now, you'll love it.
Well, up here in Canada, I had kind of hoped, when you look at some of the landmark albums by artists over the years, whether it's Bruce Springsteen's Darkness on the Edge of Town or any number of the Beatles albums or Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, up here in Canada, American Woman was one of the most important records ever released. And I sure would have loved to have seen that receive the box set treatment, if you will, as a 50th anniversary release of an absolute landmark record in Canada. That would have been so cool. Maybe finding tracks from the elusive Fillmore concert that apparently tapes exist, but I've certainly never heard them. And I've heard virtually every bootleg of the Guess Who in existence. But if that existed, to be able to properly package that, commemorate it, and celebrate that record, it's a shame that never happened.
No kidding. Yeah, that's a classic moment. And folks, we might want to fill in the blanks on that one because there they are, number 1 hit, taken over all over the world, one of the biggest hits of that year. What was it, 69 or 68? 69 or 70? 1970, one of the biggest hits of that year.
Yeah.
At one point, according to Cashbox magazine, Guess Who outsold the Beatles in singles?
In 1970, they did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
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 Think about that for a minute, folks. The Beatles were still together at that point, and they were outselling them. Incredible. So at the height of all this, I'm sitting on top of the world, right? Randy Bachman leaves the group just like that. And the whole music industry went, what? Now, we won't get into the whys and wherefores because this story's been talked about for decades now, and
Sure.
you can go find that stuff somewhere else. But they had to forge on without Randy Bachman, who was pretty much the band's leader and principal songwriter. So here comes Kurt Winter and Greg Lescue, a couple of associates that they knew from Winnipeg in that area there.
Mhm.
And they released the Shared Land album. And they really didn't miss a beat, did they? It's pretty
No, they did
remarkable.
not. Share the Land for many, many Guess Who fans, Share the Land is the album. And I think rightfully so. Asking me what my favorite Guess Who album is like asking me who my favorite child is. I love the albums. I think they're all great. But Share the Land is an outstanding record. And all of the guys are showcased. There are some terrific hits on the album. There's some great deep cuts like 3 More Days. There's some it was I would say the sound of the Guess Who changed with Kurt Winter and Greg Lescue. They became an even slicker hard rock outfit compared to the more pop oriented Guess Who that Randy Bachman was leading. Randy was going in a rock and roll direction, but Kurt Winter was laser focused.
First of all, Hang On to Your Life is the closest thing the Guess Who ever did to a metal song.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? That's the
Yep.
toughest sound they ever had
Yep.
on Hang On to Your Life. That thing is just boom
Yep.
in your face. And this was also the period where Burton Cummings sat down at the Steinway and never got up again.
Yep.
Right? This was that period. I
Mhm.
wonder what was going on that caused that. Maybe the double guitar attack they wanted to just fill that sound out a little bit or something. But you know what? That worked. That became the signature Guess Who sound from that point on.
And that's really, I mean, I was aware of the singles before that, but for me, that singing piano player from Winnipeg, playing things like Share the Land, and Bus Rider, the pounding piano in the background on Bus Rider, that locked it in for me. These guys were a band I was going to follow.
Well, there's another factor. He played a grand piano.
Yeah.
He didn't play a Fender Rhodes all the time. He didn't play a B3 organ. He played a grand piano, which you hold around on the road in 2 continents.
Oh, I know.
I mean, that was rare for its time. It really was.
Yes. Yeah.
So that really made the Guess Who sound definable. And,
Very
when
much
you
so.
look at the next 5 or 6 singles, you can tell it was the Guess Who.
Yep.
Like songs like Rain Dance and
Albert Flasher.
Albert Flash, that was their sound for the longest time, probably about 3 years, I would say.
Yeah.
And well, through Road Food, really?
Yeah.
Really? That was the Guess Who sound.
You look at the
were a
string
main
of
component in it.
You look at the string of singles, Albert Flasher, Rain Dance, Guns, Guns, Guns. Then you look at Orly, you look at Star Baby, even Glamour Boy. It's that vocal piano, that strong piano supporting role in the whole song structure. It's no accident.
No, and it worked. It worked like gangbusters. It really
It did.
'Cause many people associate that middle period with the Guess Who sound.
Yep.
They really do. I mean, because they stuck with that until the bulk of their career, really.
Yep.
Until the last album. So after they Shared the Land, which was a triumph and a good seller, and a lot of singles were sold.
Yep.
Here comes So Long Bannatyne.
Mhm.
I like that record, but I got the feeling, I don't know how to put it. I think they thought their poop didn't stink at that point and put out a couple of tracks that I thought were total filler, if you know what I mean. And they thought they were funny all of a sudden. And I think that the record didn't do as well as it could have if it had a stronger 10 or 8 or 10 tracks.
John Anderson, a writer in Winnipeg, has suggested that So Long Bannatyne would have been a totally different record had Albert Flasher and Broken, which were only released as a single, been included as on that album.
I never considered that. You're right. That was the days of the single that was just a single. You're right. It would have been a better album with those on. Absolutely.
But the word, when I think, I mean, I like Bannatyne. I like the album. I think there's some absolutely wonderful songs on that album. but the word self-indulgent, it's like we've had hits, we've been on top of the world. Now we're going to show our listening public what kind of artists we really are. And so they started to do more experimental things, like going a little crazy, even an extended blues like So Long Bannatyne.
Right.
Great. Yeah. And it was a little bit cliche, but I still think it's a good record.
It's a good record. But you know what? I think that they were a band at that point in my fandom. I thought they needed to be taken a little more seriously from the FM crowd. And a song like Fiddlin' ain't going to do it.
No.
And a song like One Man Army wasn't going to do it. I'm sorry. I just wish they had done more serious material and cut it out with the forced humor.
I liked the riff of One Man Army. It would have been a great for it, but they should have written a song around it instead of doing the musical theater. Another song on Bannatyne that does not get its due is Grey Day.
Yes, Grey Day is amazing playing.
Burton's piano playing is phenomenal. Burton's vocal, and that's what saved it. Usually Greg got to sing his own songs, but Burton, for whatever reason, ended up singing the lead. Right. And of course, that made the song.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't you? I mean, and I had this conversation with Greg Lescu. And when you're young and you're in a band, I mean, I maintain that every band starts to break up about 2 weeks after they started because egos start to get into it. And Greg has said to me that had he known then what he knows now, he would have shut his mouth and played, because he was playing with one of the biggest rock and roll bands in the world. And so what if he was only getting one song on each album? That was plenty. He was in one of the best rock and roll bands in the world.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, a couple of his songs are real good. One Divide is a great song. One Divide is a really cool song and very original.
Mm-hmm.
Very original. And
Greg Lescu is a great talent.
Even Steve Simmels of Stereo Review, one of his favorite Guess Who songs. You remember Stereo Review magazine? Yes. One of his favorite songs was Herbert's a Loser, and one of mine too. And you know what? Let's get into Rockin' now. The album called Rockin', because you know what? That is the punkiest, sloppiest, nastiest, most wonderful record. Real serious Guess Who fans consider that one of their favorites. What do you think?
I understand why they consider it one of their favorites. I know from Burton's standpoint, it was one of his favorites because they went into the studio on a Monday and handed the master tapes into their producers on the Friday afternoon. They were rehearsed. They were prepared for that album. I will say, and I know that you had some very good things to say about Hand Me Down World, and I don't disagree with you in any way about that. But I would suggest to you that the production of Guns, Guns, Guns on the Rockin' album is one of Jack Richardson's greatest achievements.
Really?
And Guns, Guns, Guns as a song is, in my opinion, it's got a political part to it and everything.
Mm-hmm.
That is Burton Cummings, Ohio, with all due respect to Neil Young. It's as strong a song as the lyrics are just as relevant. Musically, it's incredible. When you listen to you've got a cappella chorus, stark piano with just the drums, no guitars, then the bass comes in. Then you have the twin leads coming in at the same time. The production on that, and then all of a sudden you've got 5 voices going, American Hunter, bring him up the north side. It is wonderful.
Well, I think Burton agrees with you because he re-recorded it on one of his solo albums.
No accident.
And he still plays it to this day when you go see him live. And it wasn't a hit.
Yep.
So, you know what? Audiences love it. Real Guess Who fans are crazy about it. And like I said, Herbert's a Loser. That raucous mess, that beautiful, beautiful, wacky, silly Greg Lescu composition. Kurt Winter at the end. The song just deteriorates wonderfully. I don't know how to put it. It's a unique sonic experience. The whole record is, fun.
I have a recording of Mujaja, which was Greg Lescu's band that he formed after he left the Guess Who. Mujaja doing Herbert's a Loser and also doing Grey Day. They do both of those songs very differently from their Guess Who.
I'm sure they did.
But I'll tell you another song that I love on Rockin' is Nashville Sneakers. How can you
Oh,
not?
yeah. You know, I had a friend as a kid who knew nothing about the Guess Who. And he comes up to my bedroom where I had my little $44 stereo, right?
Yes.
And I had rock, and I said, listen to this band. And he listened from Her Solution to the end, right?
Yes.
And he went, wow, that's a heavy group. You got any more? So then we put Road Food on.
Yeah.
And he went, I didn't know they were this good. You know, a lot of people didn't hear the albums. Let's be honest. They sold
Yeah.
a lot more singles than they did albums in
Oh, yes.
the lower 48, at least.
Yep. Mhm.
And once people discover the records, that's when they become diehards, I think. The whole albums. They made a lot of good albums, you know, and we're talking about them now. So, and that was followed up by the infamous Live at the Paramount. Lester Bangs, folks, Lester Bangs. I'll let Lester Bangs speak for me. What do you think?
I was a fan of the Guess Who, but when Live at the Paramount came out, that was when the Guess Who became my favorite band.
Really?
I love Live at the Paramount. I think it's one of the greatest live albums ever released. And I'll tell you why. We have a reissue of Live at the Paramount issued in 2000 where they added about 7 other songs, hits like These Eyes. Live at the Paramount really didn't render the hits the way the hits were heard on the radio.
Right.
Albert Flasher was slowed right down. American Woman was extended from 3 minutes to 17 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had things like Running Back Through Saskatoon. You had Pain Train, which was magnificent. And all of a sudden, this was a record that forced you to realize you had to take these guys seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You listened to Burton Cummings lead that band during American Woman and Trucking Off Across the Sky. That side is some of the best 22 minutes of music you'll ever hear. And it's absolutely glorious. And I may be saying things that you completely disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine.
No.
But I think that album forced the critics like Lester Bangs to say, hold it. These guys aren't a bunch of bubblegum singles guys. These guys can also rock out.
Well, they had attitude. They had attitude. They were punky.
Yeah.
I absolutely think that the greatest Kurt Winter solo from my ears is the live version of Running Back to Saskatoon. That is a monstrous solo. It's too short.
Yep.
I think it's Kurt Winter's greatest moment. That it just roars. It's, you know what it sounds like? A train roaring out of the station. You know, it's just that when that solo takes that song over, bang. And it's a unique song. It's a travelogue, you know, and it's a fun song. And that's why I love the Running Back Through Canada shows. And I actually went to Montreal to see. They always started those shows with Running Back to Saskatoon, which
absolutely
I thought was awesome. Yeah, it's a classic, and I'm glad they did an extended version later. I think Buddha Records put out on its CD.
Yep.
It's a good moment, and you know, it sold pretty good, that record. That's one of the better sellers from that time period.
It woke people up all of a sudden. You know, the Guess Who, they So Long Band of Time and Rockin' had kind of the band had certainly dropped in stature at that point after Share the Land. They were huge in Canada, but in the States they were flattening out. And Paramount made them, even for a brief period of time, made people sit up and take notice again and say, "Oh, that's who these guys are."
The amazing thing about the Guess Who here down in the lower 48, though, I know for a fact they were still touring when the albums weren't selling and doing good.
Yep.
They would come down to the States on the basis of their hit singles, which were classics already. And they did good numbers in concerts in the United States.
Yep. The American Midwest, was really their heartland.
There's a bootleg from the Troiano era from Portland, which has terrible sound, but the fans sound like they're seeing the Beatles.
Yep.
Raucous cheers. And you've heard this, obviously.
Yep.
Well, that's a great performance, too. Unbelievable. They were so good in that period, but we'll get back to that. So here comes 2 records that people don't know.
No.
The Publishers Clearinghouse mock mailer cover of Artificial Paradise and Number 10. An album I really like. I really like number 10 a lot. It's one of my favorites. Artificial Paradise. I wrote something here when I was. We kind of talked about what we're going to talk about here, and I said I've read people call Artificial Paradise the Guess Who's Mardi Gras, where Creedence everybody sang.
Yep.
Artificial Paradise, everybody sang. Bill Wallace and Don McDougall got some lead vocals.
Mm-hmm.
The record tanked.
Yep.
I mean, nobody bought that record. I mean, that thing barely made a blip on the Billboard 200. There was no, Follow Your Daughter Home was the choice of single, which I didn't agree with. What are your impressions of Artificial Paradise?
Well,
by the way, the first record with the new bass player, Bill Wallace. And I should mention Donnie McDougall joined live at the Paramount Time.
Yes.
And stayed with the band for quite a while. But anyway, Artificial Paradise.
Artificial Paradise was very much intended to be a statement, because Jim Cale had left, Greg Lescue had left, and this was and so they were reestablishing themselves. And Burton was all about the democracy in the band. That here we had 3 different lead singers, we've got 4 writers, they started the album with Bye Bye Babe, which is a Bill Wallace lead vocal, for goodness sakes. Bill Wallace, I look at that as Bill Wallace's album, because he co-wrote at least 6 of the 11 songs on that album. And he was, in fact, when he joined the band, he became the musical director. You're going to notice something also in that situation, and that is, all of a sudden the Winter Cummings collaborative arrangement seemed to disappear. It was certainly there in Rockin' and So Long Bannatyne and Share the Land, but something was happening, and really the last Cummings Winter collaboration was running back through Saskatoon.
Mm-hmm.
Afterwards, there would be a brother tune that Bill Wallace also played in Brother with Kurt Winter back in 1970. So they would be pulling out these old Brother tunes, things like All Hashed Out, that Kurt and Don and Bill were on, and then Burton would get a writing credit because he had something to do with it as well. He had something to add, but suddenly the Winter Cummings collaboration seemed to be over, and that continued. So you had an album that was kind of like Wheatfield Soul. Stylistically, every song is different from one right. song to the next. I mean, right. You're finishing up with a harpsichord euphonium tune called The Watcher. And then you're starting off with a straight ahead rock and roll with Bye Bye Babe, sung by Bill Wallace, and then you've got these beautiful vocal performances by Don McDougall on Samantha's Living Room and Lost and Found Town. Lost and Found Town has a bass solo.
Yes,
Wallace.
How
often do you get to hear that?
You beat me to it. That is a tremendous arrangement on that song. Very, very. It's almost jazz. It's almost jazz. It's probably McDougall's great moment in the band, I think.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. I think Donnie was a huge talent. In most groups, he would be the lead singer. Right. But when you're in a group with Burton Cummings, that's not going to be the way it works. But he certainly had that ability. And no, he has some great songs in there. Bill Wallace, I've gotten to know Bill over the years, and he's quite a musician, very accomplished musician. He taught high school music after he left the Guess Who. He went back to Winnipeg, got his music teaching degree, and taught high school music right up until he stopped there and went back into the Guess Who in 2000. He walked away from his pension at that point in time to take that gig. But he could. When I talk to Bill, both Bill and I happen to play the trombone, and Bill wants to talk to me about my trombone when I get talking to him. He's great, but he's a very, very versatile musician. He brought a whole different set of values to the band than Jim Cale. I won't say anything bad about Jim Cale's playing. He was a phenomenal bass player. But Bill Wallace was probably a more complete musician.
I think Cale in the early days was a big focal point when they were on television. I think Cale liked being on TV. He would be like the funny guy on stage. He
Tried to be.
He tried to be, right. But he was like the clown in the band, and it worked at many times. It was effective, and
You'd listen to the iconoclastic reissue of Wheatfield Soul, and the bass playing is what stands out. It's amazing.
Oh, When You Touch Me, right?
Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
Great bass playing in that song.
Yep.
Again, he drives that one the same way he drove "It's My Pride." That's a good choice for best of Jim Cale. That's right.
Yeah.
So anyway, then there's number 10. And
Yep.
I read somewhere that RC put the hammer and said, "Burton, you got to sing." Is that true?
I don't think that was RCA. I think it was Burton.
Really? Okay.
And that's really some of the cause of dissension. I think it's fairly well known that Kurt had some issues with alcohol. And I think that probably contributed to the fact that he and Burton were no longer writing. But when Burton came along and basically said, I either sing all the songs or I'm out of here, giving that ultimatum was a bit of a turnoff for the rest of the guys. And it was kind of probably the beginning of the end. However, I think that number 10 is an outstanding album. I have referred to this in the past, and Burton, I've suggested this to Burton, and he agrees with me, that number 10 is really the very first Burton Cummings solo album.
Yeah. Songs like Self-Pity, right, Lie Down, right, yeah. Yeah. He was sardonic about the music business at that point. It was starting to come through in his writing. Glamour Boy too, when you think about it.
Just Let Me Sing.
Yeah.
There's some great tunes on that album, and then he even though Take It Off My Shoulders was a Donnie McDougall tune, Burton basically, again, when he takes over the lead vocal, he transforms the song. I think to myself, how much more incredible would Taking Care of Business been had Burton Cummings sang the lead vocal instead of Randy Bachman?
We'll
Anyway,
never know.
We'll never know. But
by the way, I can't pronounce it.
Musicione.
Thank you. A great Kurt Winter moment.
Oh yeah.
Maybe his last great moment, on the record anyway. I mean, that's whoa. It just starts with him soloing. Whoa.
There's some great playing on the next album, Road Food.
Yes.
But
if we'll just let me just
sure.
If I have one quibble about the Gassou.
Yes.
Is that the guitar solos on the records were too short. For the most part. It was always like one stanza out. Other than American Woman and the early stuff with Bachman, I think Kurt really, maybe live, they gave him more time to stretch out. I never saw them live. All right. They didn't play around while I was living in the Albany area. I never got to see them. But you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's almost, when you hear that kind of playing, you want to hear a little more of it once in a while. What do you think? Or maybe it's the curse of the single, I guess.
When I think you listen to the bootlegs and you know that Kurt was certainly capable of playing some great solos, some great extended solos. He was never in league with Domenic Troiano in that regard, but I think Kurt had I think he had great capability in writing. As a player, I'm not sure that he was prepared to be. He was more about the song craft than the extended soloing and the the improvisational aspect of the song. Whereas people like Greg Lescue and Domenic Troiano, they wanted to stretch things out and see what could happen. Kurt was into making a statement. Once they got into live concert, Burton would crank up the vocals, and Kurt could go into some extended soloing. I mean, we hear that on the live recordings for sure. But I think in the studio they had a mission to accomplish, and Kurt made sure that he accomplished it.
There you go. Okay, comeback time. Road Food.
Road Food had that was an interesting album. My understanding is Kurt and Donnie were not particularly interested at that point. And they got things started in Toronto and they finished recording in LA. There were two major recording sessions. And when they got to LA, Kurt and Donnie were more interested in partying than actually showing up. And so that album is very much Bill Wallace stepping in to help Burton finish the record, make sure that the record got made. It's one of the reasons like a song like Don't You Want Me was because they were running out of material. Burton had basically sat down in the studio and composed Ballad of the Last 5 Years in the studio.
Really?
Because they needed the material.
Wow.
But at the same time, so at that point in time, things were starting to unravel in the group from a personnel standpoint. There was some abuse issues, some substance abuse issues going on at the time. There was in a downhill spiral. Burton was quoted in, I think, late March of 1974 as saying that he'd quit this band in a heartbeat if he got the right movie role. And next thing you know, he's recording a soundtrack for a movie, and Kurt Winter is being pushed out. And I wouldn't have been surprised in the spring of 1974 for the Guess Who to disband, and Burton to start into his solo career and his movie career and all that kind of thing, except Clap for the Wolfman all of a sudden hit the top 10 in North America. And suddenly the Guess Who had gas in the tank.
Well, you know what I think helped in that period? Some very well-timed Midnight Special appearances.
Mm-hmm.
They were good on the Midnight Special. They were very appealing.
Outstanding.
Yeah, very appealing. I think the producers, Burt Sugarman, knew it. He kept bringing them back again and again, if you recall.
For all of the things that were going on with the group, no one ever came away from a Guess Who concert feeling cheated.
Mm-hmm.
The guys played their hearts out, and they were professionals, and they were absolutely outstanding. So, yeah, I agree with you. The Midnight Specials were great venues for them to showcase talent to people that otherwise hadn't seen these guys. They might have heard the odd song in the record, but when you see them on the Midnight Special, you realize, oh, this is who these guys are. And
Right.
they were, those recordings from the Midnight Special are they honestly, you have to look at it and say, maybe they should be released commercially.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
Well, let us not forget Star Baby, which, if my memory is correct, I use no notes, folks, but if my memory is correct, Star Baby was a very strange hit record in that it never rose above the 30s in the United States, but it stayed on the charts for like 39 weeks.
Yes.
Some crazy long time like that. It seemed to hit different markets at different times, buoyed by their Midnight Special appearances, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. But it's a great piano rocker, and Burton's vocals are par excellence. Let's not forget Kurt Winter's slide guitar on Star Baby. That was very evident on the Midnight Specials.
That was a fun record.
Yes, it was.
People really liked that record. It was like a very upbeat. I mean, if you cut out Clap for the Wolfman a minute, you go from Star Baby to Dancing Fool, they both had a very similar fun vibe to them.
Yep.
And I think that was a good way to go. I mean, Cummings was better at writing lyrics like that than he thinks he was.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? He kind of puts down the lyrics in Dancing Fool in his old age, but you know what? That's a great tune. That was a rocking tune on the AM. I'll tell you that much.
It's a wonderful tune. And the Troiano music on Flavors and Power in the Music. There's nothing wrong with music. If it's not your taste, I get it, and I respect that you don't like it. If it's not your taste, but everybody is entitled to their musical tastes. But don't ever tell me that it's not good music and it's not amazing music. It's like somebody saying to me, "I like Beethoven and Mozart, but I don't like Mozart as much as I like Beethoven. That doesn't mean that Mozart isn't a genius, and it doesn't mean that his music isn't magnificent.
I do not agree with the notion that when Domenic Troiano joined the Guess Who for Flavors and Power in the Music, that he was too progressive. I know progressive rock. I'd listen to it. I'm a Chick Corea fan.
Yep.
Okay. Dominic never got near anything like that, not even close. His chord progressions and changes may be a little bit, let's face it, Long Gone has a very unique time signature to it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Very, very unlike, pop records. Doesn't mean it wasn't a good song and well performed.
No.
With a great solo. Dancing Fool was a hit right out of the box because, they were still feeling the Midnight Special rub at that point. And it's a really good record. Digging Yourself is a work of art. That is a great song. Somebody very close to me goes, that may be my favorite Guess Who song.
Wow.
Seriously. Because that was very unlike, it's got a unique lyric, a great groove, and Dominic is just sparkling on that tune. Flavors is, to me, my favorite Guess Who album.
That's interesting. Not many people would agree with you on that, but everyone, again, it's a matter of taste. I think it's a fantastic record. Garry Peterson has said to me that he considers I to be Burton's best vocal performance on a Guess Who record.
He makes a good point.
Yep. But it was, and I had this conversation with Dominic, and Dominic was the first to admit that in retrospect, he was probably too much too fast. He changed the sound of the Guess Who, and he acknowledges it. But the Guess Who, when they brought in Domenic Troiano, he initially didn't even want to join the band, but they convinced him and he came on board. They were all in. They knew exactly what they were getting. I mean, Bill and Garry knew fully what was going to happen. They knew this guy's reputation. They knew that he was going to change the sound of the band, and they were embracing that. Listen to the Doobie Brothers back at that same period of time and see how the sound of the Doobie Brothers was changing as they went from Tom Johnston to Mike McDonald. And two very different. Steely Dan was changing their sound from Murky Don't Lose That Number to the Royal Scam.
Right.
And all of a sudden, so the Guess Who, to change things from Clap for the Wolf Band to Long Gone and Digging Yourself, why is that such a stretch?
I went to college at SUNY Brockport, not far from Canada.
Okay.
It's 1976.
Mm-hmm.
I think Flavors came out in 74, 75. I'm not sure.
74.
But we're near the Canadian border.
Yep.
So there are a lot of Guess Who fans. I'm a single guy. I'm away from home. I don't have any girlfriends, but somehow I ended up in one of the women's dormitories. And behind a closed door, I heard somebody playing Flavors. And the second song comes on, and the girl goes, "Ooh, hoedown time." I went, "Wow, girls like the Guess Who." And I'll tell you what. That is my reasoning for saying the music was not too progressive. It was accessible.
Sure, it was.
That album was accessible.
Sure,
with the possible exception of Long Gone, but it's the closer.
Yep.
I mean, "Loves Me Like a Brother" is a kind of grooving little slick tune. And, Garry Peterson raved. I read this somewhere. He raved about Burton's country singing, and it seems like I Can't Live With You, Can't Live Without You, which got covered, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, that's a really strong record. Like you mentioned, Dirty for a little bit of, hard rock right in the middle of it. I mean, that's a good record, man.
Yep.
And then came the last RCA before Burton decided to hang up his hat. The album is called Power in the Music. I thought the mix was dark. Very Jack Richardson. I don't know if it was the recording or the mix or something, but it had a darker sound to it than Flavors did. And I can't put my finger on it. You know what I'm saying? It didn't sparkle. It didn't jump off the grooves like the previous record. Did he have any opinion on that?
I do. What I noticed was when Dominic joined the band and Burton started recording with Dominic, that Burton's vocals were much more subdued and controlled in the studio. So the songs on the records you used the word darker. That's not a bad word to describe it, because the tunes were more, I would use the word subdued. But you take those same songs and put Burton on a stage and sing them in concert.
Mm-hmm.
A song like Dirty, he just start wailing away, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, this is why this is a good song.
Right.
So I think the only song that he really cut loose on in Power into Music was Band was singing Shaking All Over, which in my opinion is one of their greatest songs.
Really?
Yes.
That's a unique choice.
Yeah. And so his singing is outstanding. But then listen to Burton singing on Coors for Sunday. I mean, Domenic makes Coors for Sunday. I mean, this is a fantastic tune. I love it. But it's not Burton singing that makes that song.
Right.
And usually a great Guess Who song is because of Burton Cummings.
Right.
Yeah.
I have an affinity for Rich World, Poor World. I know a lot of people that despise that song because it's so, it's so, serious.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, that's one of Dominic's most slamming grooves, which he reused from his Bush days, although it was never recorded. Let's be fair about that. At first I said, oh, he's repeating himself. And then I realized that the live album that was released in the Bush CD release was never meant to be released.
Nope.
So he never released.
Exactly what Domenic told me.
So he had a right to reuse that riff.
Yep.
And that is that's a broiling riff. It's one of my favorite Domenic moments, including the solo, everything about that song. I love that song.
No, Domenic told me that I asked him about it. He said, honestly, Mark, I thought that Wicked Woman would see the light of day. So he took that riff, and it was a great riff.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, Burton and Domenic wrote all the songs for Flavors and Power into Music in their first 2 weeks together in June of 1974 in Burton's big house in Winnipeg.
Wow. Yeah, Burton told stories about how they do these all-nighters.
Yep.
And Domenic would feed him the Italian coffee, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway, and at that point, and there's bootlegs that prove this, during the RCA period, they were never better live than with Domenic. They were tight and professional and rocking and soulful, and the shows were like a roller coaster. You'd have some light stuff followed by some Domenic playing, and they would jam out on depending on what show you heard. Like they took these showbiz shoes from Artificial Paradise and made it a Domenic song in the center.
Yes,
and everything was minute right. Everything on those bootlegs I've heard is minute rice perfect. They were never that. I'm sorry. I love the Kurt Winter era. Don't get me wrong. Donnie McDougall, everybody else. There's something about what they became that I found absolutely thrilling.
Yep.
And I know most fans won't agree with it. Most hardcore fans won't agree with that. I say take a listen to those bootlegs. Wow.
Well, the Live at Electric Ladyland.
That too, yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Winnipeg Playhouse Theater of April of 75. That was a full 2-hour radio broadcast. It's amazing.
Yep. And there's one from Portland which has really bad sound quality, but my educated ear can hear around all the noise.
Yep.
And they were just broiling the whole doggone show. And the fans sounded like they saw the Beatles. Mm-hmm. I'm telling you.
Yep.
So that's it for RCA, folks. And but let's turn that clock forward a long time to the year 1999.
Right.
When the original Guess Who is persuaded to play the Grey Cup finals.
They were persuaded to play the Pan Am Games.
Pan Am Games, not the Grey Cup.
They were being held in Winnipeg, and the Premier of Manitoba, Garry Philmond, he contacted the band and offered them big money to come up and sing 4 songs.
So they did.
Yeah, they did. But the minute they started to sing and play, I remember being in my living room watching it on TV. I turned to my wife and I said, they're going to tour and I will be catching more than one show. This is going to be amazing. It was so electric. The energy that night, that was, on those 4 songs, American Woman, These Eyes Undone, and No Time, where it was just Oh, it was like these guys had not skipped a beat.
Right.
It was outstanding.
So here they come. They're back, and they decided to tour for 2 or 3 years. Many dates in the States, and I bought stacks of tickets, my friend. Saw them
Yep.
probably about 6 times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when the first tour was in Canada only, so we flew to Montreal.
Right. Yeah.
One of the best shows I ever saw. And for Guess Who Completist, for the real diehard fans, they played everything on that Canadian tour. They played Orly. They played Heartbroken Bopper. They played songs you never heard them play even when they were new.
Yep.
And what a tour that was. Holy smokes, man.
Well,
something got onto them, and they did it for 2 more years and came down to the States, and they did one tour with Joe Cocker, which is really memorable.
Mm-hmm.
Because for us, it got kind of sideswiped for a few days because of 9/11.
Yep.
And we went to the show in Wallingford, Connecticut. It was Cocker. And I'm going to this is something from the heart here. Joe Cocker sang Up Where We Belong.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole crowd cried. I've never seen anything like it. Because at that moment,
really,
you needed a sort of a soul lift at that point. We all felt, we're all still feeling 9/11 at that point. And then Burton and the band came out. And Burton said a few things about how America has been bailing all the other countries out for all these years. And, we deserve to be defended now. And at the end of the show was a giant American flag behind them.
Mm-hmm.
I will never forget that show.
No.
As somebody who lives in New York City, my friend, I will never forget that show.
No. Well, I think all of us remember. Well, of course, you were much closer to it than I am back here in Canada. But I was in Buffalo on 4 nights before on the 7th of September, and I saw them in Buffalo playing. And then 4 days later, we've got 9/11, and of course, everything's just unbelievable. I mean, it was just, I have a brother that lives in the States at the time, and of course we were, everybody's reaching out and you can't get in touch with anybody, and it was just a strange time, and it kind of sideswiped the Guess Who. They're in the middle of their coming back through American Woman tour, and this is kind of like their triumphant return to the United States, and all of a sudden this happens, which is a shame.
And they were stuck in New York?
Uh-huh.
They were stuck in New York at that point.
They were?
Yeah. And it's like, I had tickets to see them in Philadelphia, which was one of the first shows they resumed that tour.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel safe to go. I ate them. You know what I'm saying? And I think, but I will say that I was never so proud. I saw that tour at the Saratoga Performing Arts Center in upstate New York, the Cocker, and I brought my brother. And we're surrounded by people. A guy turns around in front of me. He says, "I'm here to see Cocker. What's this other band?" I said, "What's this other band?" I said, "Wait a minute." And he waited the whole show. And as I'm walking out, I'm listening to the fans going, "I never knew they were that good. Boy, they're good. Wow, that was great." They played every song. I knew every song. On and on and on. I think that reunion was probably, if you count, that's probably, if I had to introduce the Guess Who to new fans, people who've never heard them or seen them, the running back through Canada DVD is a good start.
Yep.
Because they were really on top of their game at that point. And I would think you'd agree with me, right?
Oh, I went in June of 2000. The Saturday, June the 10th, I was at Kitchener, and I saw them. 2 days later, they were in Peterborough, which is about half an hour from where I live, and I went and saw them again. I got a chance to see Donnie McDougall after the show. 3 days later, they were in Toronto, and I was there, and I took a couple of coworkers to that show, and we drove home that evening. And the guys that were with me, the coworkers, they were like, you know what? I didn't realize the Guess Who did all those songs. There was only one song I didn't recognize. They were all hits.
Right. Right.
They
That's how
it was
people react. Yeah.
yes. And I saw them later in the fall. I saw them in Hamilton. I saw them 5 times in 2000, and it was just as a fan. I made this comment to John Anerson. I said, fans of the Guess Who do not have they have no right to feel cheated. We got these reunion tours that were exhaustive, when the band, everybody could still play and play well.
Mm-hmm.
We got all of the albums reissued with bonus tracks. We got innumerable TV and concert specials. We got all the bootlegs for most of the Running Back Through Canada tour and through the States in the following year. The Darien Lake show in 2002 is an outstanding concert. At Darien Lake, I went back to the hotel and sat up with Bill Wallace and Donnie McDougall till about 3:00 in the morning, talking about the old days. That was a memory for me.
Nice.
And 2 days later, a fellow that I was sitting beside at that concert mailed me 2 CDs of the full concert that he had recorded. It was just outstanding. But they were great.
Well, Mark, as Guess Who fans, let us give thanks for one more thing. They're still doing it.
Yep.
Burton Cummings is about to embark this summer on a U.S. tour for the first time in quite a while. I had seen him at this Sony Theater in, what do they call it? Sony Hall in New York City. Great show.
Right.
And now they're coming back to the States. So him and his Carpet Frogs, and I love the Carpet Frogs. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, they're great.
I love that band. I would see that band. I would go see them play covers.
Yes.
I would. I think they're fantastic music. It's one of the best bands Burton has ever played with. It really is.
True.
Fantastic. And 2 months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, I saw the Randy Bachman's revival, what he's calling Bachman Turner Overdrive, featuring Randy Bachman at the Westbury Music Fair, which is renamed its old name again, which is wonderful, in Long Island here. And they brought the house down and sold out the venue. It's about a 5,000 seater. And you know what? They exceeded my expectations tenfold. Tal Bachman is in the band. And they were great. People went nuts.
Randy Bachman is
80 years old.
I know.
We're very lucky. So many of our musical heroes are not with us now.
Mm-hmm.
And we still got these guys. Yep. Folks, I say, and I think Mark would agree with me, get out there and see them.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I have to tell you something, Mark Doble. My love for the Guess Who and Domenic Troiano is people who know me go, shut up, Bob, right? Because I'm always talking about him. I want you to know that this particular interview is a high watermark for me as a podcaster, because I couldn't ask for a better guest to explain what was going on with the Guess Who in the day, because you were there, my friend. And this is as much fun as I could possibly have, Mark. I'm telling you, I'm so appreciative that you've saw clear. You didn't know who I was when I contacted you, and I had to talk my way into this. But I am so happy, because you know what? I feel like I'm 15 talking to you, man.
Well, I'm certainly delighted to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about Domenic and the Guess Who, and it's certainly been a pleasure on my side as well. And maybe we can do it again.
I would love to. I'd love to. We'll find an excuse to do this. How's that?
Sure.
And, in New York, I was working for Good Times Magazine for a while.
Yes.
And I went to my boss. I said, this book's coming out. You got to do something. So I got the book a little bit of publicity. It was all on me, when it first came out, because Frank and I have become internet friends on Facebook.
Oh, good.
He knows who I am.
Yes.
And we had many conversations. He sent me the galleys, and he sent me some publicity materials, and I disseminated it to about 18 different local news organizations, hoping they would spread the word. I know at least 3 or 4 of them actually did, which is great. So this is how serious I was about that Domenic Troiano book. It is one of the books it's an answered prayer for somebody like me. Well, because, I'm trying to tell people, I feel like I'm screaming into a cave, Domenic Troiano. And people go, who in the cave, right? And I'm like, you're going to find out who he is, and you're going to love it. And you know what? The people that I have introduced him to love it.
I really appreciate your kind words. It was a joy and a privilege to be able to write it. I became, in the process, Frank Troiano and I became very close friends. And let me tell you, I couldn't have had a better co-writer than Frank, a better person to work with. We got such a wonderful response from people that helped us write the book by giving us their submissions. I won't say who, but I had people phoning me after the book came out, and before they could get any words out of their mouth, they'd burst into tears. They were so emotionally drawn to the book. And for me, that it's very humbling for that, something like that to happen. But it tells me that we touched some lives. I know that the Troiano family, on a personal level, are very grateful for the book. And for me, that's everything. Domenic Troiano was one of those amazing human beings who deserves to be remembered for the great person that he was. I'd like to think that I'm just sorry that Domenic wasn't here when I wrote it, but I'd like to think that he'd approve of everything that we did. And but it was an honor for me to be able to write that book, and it was pure fun. People have asked me what my next book's going to be about, and I said I'm not sure that I'll ever write another book, because I don't think I would start it if it wasn't going to be as much fun as the fun that I had writing this last one. I got to meet so many of my musical heroes, and to get the love and support that we got from all of those folks to put that together, it was just a real special privilege for me. And it's a special privilege for me to be able to come on and talk to you, 2.5 years after we put the book out, Bob, to know that there are people out there that are still interested in it. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to join you on this podcast.
Well, can I tell you my favorite compliment I've ever gotten as a musician? It has to do with Domenic.
Okay.
In a way, I was a good enough blues singer to have an album produced by the great Duke Robillard.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
See, not everybody gets to work with Duke Robillard. Okay.
No.
I was good enough, and I brought my band together, and I had some of his musicians, and I made an album in 1999 called Metropolitan Blue, which is the greatest thing I've ever done or ever will do.
Yes.
I got to play the Chicago Blues Festival 2 times. I was really doing it, man. Things were shaking. And I've retired. I'm old now.
Yep.
It's hard to jump in the van and drive to Cincinnati. You know what I'm saying? So recently, within the last year or so, I'm talking on one of the Canadian the Domenic Troiano page on Facebook.
Yes.
And I mentioned to somebody that I recorded Fannie Mae on that record, my album record. And I said, I learned that song from the Domenic Troiano version on the Tricky album.
Yes.
Sean goes, really? Sean Jackson Troiano responds. I go, Sean Jackson. Right? I'm freaking out. Sean, the singer? And I go, she goes, I'd love to hear this. And I went, here's the link. And she writes me back. She goes, I love it. It's great. I love the arrangement, blah, blah. That's the greatest compliment I ever got as a musician, man. Somebody associated with Domenic Troiano thought it was good. I rest my case, baby.
Sean Jackson Troiano is an absolutely beautiful person.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to speak with her on several occasions. Just a wonderful person to chat with. Despite the fact that she and Domenic broke up in the mid 1990s, towards the end they basically reunited. Domenic was hospitalized for about 3 or 4 months before he passed away, and Sean was in the hospital almost every day to see him, and they loved each other so much. But she is just one absolutely wonderful, gracious human being. So I'm glad you had that experience with her.
I'll tell you what, too. I sense that Domenic wrote a few songs with some really romantic lyrics. It had to be addressed to her. It had to have been on those Capitol records,
He was smitten with her when they first met in the 1960s at the Club Blue Note in Toronto, and she was only 16 years old. He was smitten.
Yeah. Not only that, she's a great singer. Gosh. I mean,
Yeah.
if you, those who've never heard her, what's this? What's the hit she had in Canada?
Just As Bad As You.
Oh man, I knew Gene McDaniels, right? The great old time '60s songwriter, and that song reminds me. That's so good. It reminds me of. I think Domenic wrote the song, and I think that it reminds me so much of Gene McDaniels. I've always wanted to play that one for Gene, but I never had an opportunity to do it.
Sean's records are all Domenic Troiano records because Domenic produced everything and Domenic wrote most of the stuff. But listen to her singing on The Outer Limits of My Soul.
Right. That's from the Burn at the Stake album, folks.
That's right. She takes the third verse, I think it is. And, he wrote that song for her. And it was just, it's big. And that's the Sean Jackson song for me.
Folks, the legacy of Domenic Troiano, the legend of the Guess Who. And if there's justice someday, they'll be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I know I'm waiting for nothing to happen, but you know what? I'm not alone in this. And there was a petition about 15 years ago, and they got thousands and thousands of signatures, and it still hasn't happened. I don't understand it.
A professor once said to me, sooner or later, mastery attracts recognition. It'll happen someday.
I'll leave it at that. Folks, get out there and enjoy the Guess Who, enjoy Domenic Troiano, and enjoy the book called Domenic Troiano, His Life and Music. It's available everywhere, including Amazon. It's written by Frank Troiano and Mark Doble, my esteemed guest. I am so proud to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bob.
I hope you enjoyed it. Our look back at the Guess Who, and a look forward, actually, as well. Our next couple of editions will also be about music, at least the next one. We're going to talk about Americana music. What is that? We're going to discuss it with an Americana artist, Pete Mancini, a rising star in that regard. And we're going to take a special look at the Byrds and Gene Clark. So if you're a fan of those acts, come back. And we're going to take a loving look at the Three Stooges. I'm not having a guest on this one because I wrote a long article on them in 2010 that I'm going to replay for you guys, based on the incredible, all-encompassing works of the Three Stooges on a DVD box set released by Columbia Home Video. I wrote an article in 2010. It still holds up, and I think it's as good a primer about them as anything you'll ever hear, so I'm my own expert on that one. I am a lifelong Stooges junkie. I can hear all the ladies switching off their podcast apps right now, but please, no, don't do that. So in any event, the Stooges, Little Americana, and a whole lot more coming up in the coming weeks on the Outdated Entertainment Hour. We're going to come out on Wednesdays every 2 weeks. I repeat that. Wednesday is our release date every second week. So you'll know when to look for the show. We have a website, outdatedentertainmenthour.buzzsprout.com, where we have all of our episodes listed. We're available wherever podcasts can be heard. Write to us at outdatedent, that's E-N-T, outdatedent@gmail.com. Look for me on Facebook. I was a musician, and on my Facebook page, I am singing with B.B. King. I made 4 albums under the name of Robert Charles. That's C-H-A-R-E-L-S. That's C-H-A-R-E-L-S. And if you want to hear my music, most of it's available free on Amazon and Spotify and other streaming services. Just ask for Robert Charles or ask for one of the songs by name. It should pop right up for you. The reason I started this podcast is that a lot of people said, yeah, I like your other show, but I'm not into wrestling. There are a few people out there like that, and I understand that. So based on my media background, I decided, let's just segue into this, see how it goes, and we'll have some fun. And I hope you'll have some fun. I want to thank once again Brian R. Solomon for his look back at the cartoon world in our first full-length podcast. And a special thanks again to Mark Doble. What a nice man. What a knowledgeable guy he is about all Canadian music, and his love, like I have, the most underrated group of all time. They belong in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Guess Who. Until next time, this is Bob Smith for the Outdated Entertainment Hour, which is a production of Bob Smith Podcasts. We will see you in 2 weeks.